Imagine this, it's Christmas morning 1986, you've been begging your parents for a skateboard, maybe a Tony Hawk, a Christian Asoy, or whatever the cool kids were riding. You tear off the wrapping paper, your heart's racing, and there it is, your very first skateboard. But instead of Powell, Peralta, or Santa Cruz, you're greeted by Variflex. Oh man. And let's be honest, for a lot of us, that's exactly how our skateboarding journey started. Maybe not the board we wanted, but definitely the board we got. The funny thing is, most of us who started skating later in the 80s or in the early 90s had no clue that Variflex was ever a legit brand. To us, it was the Kmart special, the budget board sitting on the toy shelf between Nerf footballs and pogo balls. But here's the part almost nobody realized at the time. Variflex had actually been a real skate company, a legit brand with top pro skaters, quality gear, and tons of ads in the early issues of Thrasher. For a moment, they were right there alongside Powell, Santa Cruz, and Vision. Of course, by the time most of us encountered them, that reputation was long gone, and you knew it wasn't the real deal the second you picked it up. The decks were heavy, they just didn't have any pop, they felt kind of dead under your feet, the trucks hardly turned, which made carving or turning feel like work, and the wheels, they barely rolled, and from a distance they kind of looked like pro boards, but once you actually tried to ride one, the difference was obvious. And before I ever stepped on a Variflex, my very first board was a 70s yellow roller derby banana board that belonged to my sister, and that got me stoked to ride, but obviously it wasn't gonna cut it. Before I could afford my first Vision board, I actually spent months riding my best friend's old Variflex. Compared to that banana board, it felt like a huge step up. The Variflex at least got me in the ballpark of what skateboarding had become, but you still weren't all the way there yet. It was a bridge between the old toy-like boards and the modern decks, so trust me when I say I've lived this story. But here's the twist, in the early 80s, Variflex actually had a real pro team. We're talking about guys like Lance Mountain, Eddie Elguera, Alan Losi, and even Jeff Grosso, who would go on to become one of the most influential voices in skateboarding. For a short time, Variflex was right there competing with the big dogs. So how did Variflex go from a respected pioneer with pros at the top of the game to the punchline of the skateboard world, and why do so many of us still remember our first sketchy ollies on one of these? Today we're taking a nostalgic look back at Variflex, its surprising rise, its fall into department stores, and the role it played in getting an entire generation rolling, for better or worse. Variflex wasn't always the lame board from the toy aisle. The company was founded in Southern California in 1977, and it was very much a family operation. Alan Losi's uncle Ray, his father Gil, his brother, and a cousin, they all started Variflex. From day one, there were two competing visions. Ray wanted to manufacture mass market boards for department stores, while Gil wanted to build quality skateboards and travel with a real team. That tension was baked in from the start, and Gil ultimately left the Variflex program in 1982 over the direction of the company. Early on, they tried to do both. You could buy a serious Variflex setup in a skate shop, or a cheaper version at Kmart, and for a few years, it actually worked. Then came the early 80s when skateboarding hit a major downturn. Parks were closing all over California, magazines were shrinking, and the pro ranks thinned out dramatically. Opportunities for skaters were disappearing fast, but Variflex was still trying to hold on. Lance Mountain recalls being asked to join the team right in the middle of that collapse. He even sketched out his bullseye graphic during his Variflex stint. It wasn't that Variflex was thriving, it was in survival mode, but for a while they still had a real pro team. And that roster only got stronger as the scene picked back up. By 1984, Variflex had Eddie Elguera, Eric Grisham, Jeff Grosso, Lance Mountain, Bill Beauregard, Mike and Steve Hirsch, and yes, John Lucero, who turned pro with Variflex before becoming one of the most original voices in skating. That's an incredible lineup. Mountain would join the Bones Brigade, Grosso became a cult hero and later skateboarding's historian through love letters to skateboarding. Lucero went on to launch Black Label, a company that's still respected today. Elguera was inventing vert tricks Tony Hawk himself built on, and Alan Losi, he was showing up in the magazines, making contest finals, and even landing covers, known for those floaty, stylish airs that seem to hang forever. For a brief moment, Variflex had one of the best teams in the world, and I've even got two modern boards that nod back to that era. One is a Lance Mountain deck from Flip and SoCal Skate Shop, featuring his original Variflex bullseye graphic, and then the other is an Eddie Elguera. It's a model from Asoy Skateboards. It's not an exact reproduction, but a clear tribute to his Variflex design. Holding them today, it's wild to think about how much history is tied to the brand. But here's where it all unraveled. Despite having one of the strongest teams in the industry, industry, Variflex's management pulled the plug. Why? Because that internal tug of war finally tipped to the other side. Instead of pouring money into contests and travel for pros, the company saw bigger profits chasing the mass market. Department stores wanted cheap completes and not pro models. So the support dried up. No more plane tickets, no more gas money, no more contest travel. Riders who should have been headlining events had to scramble for new sponsors or even regular jobs. The team fell apart. Mountain moved to Powell, Grosso went to Santa Cruz, Lucero went to Madrid. It wasn't about talent, it was about support. And at the very moment skateboarding was about to explode again, Variflex walked away from the core scene and set its sights on the toy aisle. It kind of makes you wonder, if Variflex had stuck with their pro team through the late 80s boom, would we be talking about them alongside Powell, and Santa Cruz today? They had the talent roster to compete. By the later 80s, you didn't see Variflex at the skate shop anymore. You saw it at Kmart, Toys R Us, and Target, shrink-wrap completes with neon graphics hanging next to G.I. Joe guys and hula hoops. And the graphics on those boards, they were a trip. Some actually look kind of legit, like something you'd expect from Vision or Powell, but others look straight out of a Saturday morning cartoon. Goofy mascots, neon explosions, designs that could have doubled as Trapper Keeper art. Boards like the Ramp Rat stand out. Ask anyone who skated in the late 80s and they'll remember that name. Variflex pumped out a whole lineup of these cartoon-inspired boards, each one just a little weirder than the last. For kids, these graphics were irresistible. For serious skaters, they were just another reminder that Variflex wasn't competing with the real brands anymore. They were competing for shelf space with toys. To parents, this was perfect. A skateboard for 30 or 40 bucks instead of spending around 100 at the skate shop. And those weren't just competitive prices, they were deliberately positioned that way. While a skateboard pro setup at a skate shop ran from 80 to 120 bucks, Variflex completes sold for $30 to $40, giving department stores the fat margin they love, while still undercutting specialty retailers by more than half. From a business perspective, that was the winning formula. Variflex may have lost credibility in skate shops, but they sold hundreds of thousands of these completes through big box stores. They traded respect for reach, and for a while it worked. But for the kids riding them, it was brutal. The boards were heavy, stiff, and clunky. Try learning to ollie on one and you'd swear it wasn't you, it was the board. Most of them felt more like riding a brick than a skateboard. In other words, Variflex went from sponsoring Lance Mountain to sponsoring your Christmas stocking. And yet they sold like crazy. For better or worse, Variflex became the starter board for an entire generation. Everyone knew that they weren't pro level, but they got kids rolling. In that sense, Variflex did exactly what they set out to do, make skateboarding more accessible, but in the process, they lost their place in the core skate world. By the 90s, Variflex was basically a sporting goods brand. They made inline skates, scooters, pads, even trampolines. Rollerblading was booming, and that's where a lot of their focus went. Skateboarding was still in the catalog, but it wasn't the centerpiece anymore. And that contrast only grew sharper as the decade rolled on. While Variflex was chasing rollerblade sales, skateboarding itself was reinventing. Companies like World Industries, Blind, and Plan B were pushing street skating into the future. Skate videos like Questionable and Virtual Reality set the tone for a new generation. By the time the X Games debuted in 1995, skateboarding was on ESPN, but Variflex wasn't even in the conversation. From a business perspective, they totally picked the wrong horse. Inline skate sales peaked around 1995 at over 19 million pairs sold, but by 2000 had crashed at under 3 million. Meanwhile, skateboard sales were climbing toward what would become a billion-dollar industry, and Variflex had already given up its seat at the table. By the late 90s, it was clear that Variflex had bet on the wrong trend. So what happened next? In 2004, Variflex was sold to Bravo Sports for about $38 million. Bravo is the company behind Kryptonix Wheels, and they've also produced skateboards under license names like Darkstar, Speed Demons, and even Vision Streetwear, along with their own in-house brands like Maple, Satellite, and Variflex. Today, the Variflex name mostly shows up on trampolines, scooters, and beginner skateboards. You won't see a Variflex booth at trade shows, but technically the brand never died. And that $38 million price tag tells you something. Even after losing credibility in the skate world, Variflex was still moving enough product through mass retailers to be valuable. From a pure sales perspective, their shift to the toy aisle totally worked, but culturally the brand was long gone from the conversation. So what's the legacy of Variflex? On one hand, it's the cautionary tale of a brand that went from sponsoring some of the best skaters in the world to being shorthand for the dreaded department store board. And on the other hand, it's also the gateway that got tons of kids skating in the first place. For every kid who quit skating because their Variflex felt like a brick with grip tape, there's another who fell in love with skating and eventually upgraded to a real deck, but only because this board was their first. And that's why Variflex sticks in people's memories. It might not have been the coolest board on the block, but for a lot of us, it was our first board, the one that we learned to tic-tac in the driveway, the one we dragged to school, the one that made us skaters. Today, collectors actually hunt these things down, especially the early pro models, but even the department store completes. The same boards that kids once mocked as Kmart specials now go for hundreds in collector groups. It's kind of funny how history changes perspective. And if you want to see just how deep the catalog goes, definitely check out Cheap Skateboard Museum on Instagram. He's archived an incredible collection of Variflex and other cheap boards, and it's like flipping through a scrapbook of every toy aisle in America. In the end, Variflex's story is complicated but unforgettable. From Lance Mountain to Jeff Grosso, from Thrasher ads to Toys R Us shelves, it's a brand that touched nearly every quarter of skateboarding culture, even if it wasn't always respected for it. So what about you? Did you ever have a Variflex? Was it your first board, or maybe the one that you couldn't wait to replace? Drop your stories in the comments. I'd love to hear them. And tell me, do you think Variflex made the right decision chasing the toy aisle, or should they have fought to stay in skate shops? Thanks for taking this nostalgic ride with me. I'm Matt, and I'll see you in the next one.